This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. Today's video is something a little different. It's a bit of an experiment, if you will. When I make my videos, my intention, almost always, is to try and offer as balanced a view of people and events from the past as I can. All the while taking into account my own biases and trying, at least as much as possible, to mitigate those. Now, what this doesn't mean is that in my own mind, I am prevented from, frankly, spiralling into my own theories about what might have really been going on in the background to these events. It also doesn't stop me from feeling that certain suggestions about the past are perhaps more accurate than others. Even though in my other videos I would certainly try to lay out as many of those suggested narratives as possible and also try to give them as much equal weighting as I could. Now, I'm not sure what title I'm going to plump for today's video, but I have been toying with Slandering the Cecils though. I suppose we're going to see how spicy I feel when it comes time to publish this one. My intention in today's video is to lay out all of the moments in English history in which I suspect that William and Robert Cecil had a guiding hand, and that is putting it mildly. In many of the examples that I am about to share with you, there are other scholars that agree with my line of thinking. However, that is not the case for all of them, at least from what I've seen so far. And so I guess there should be a caveat to this video. And so what I'm going to say is that following a message from our sponsors that's going to come now, we are about to indulge in some conspiracy speculation. And I do hope that you will enjoy it. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring another video on this channel. When it comes to building, updating and managing my website, Squarespace has really made all of the difference. Their Fluid Engine website design system offers a massive variety of website templates, all of which are super easy to customise in every way. It's literally just drag and drop. For even more convenience, you can edit your website not only on your desktop at home, but also on the go on your phone. I can also keep track of my website traffic both at home and on the go, because Squarespace gives you a whole bunch of really useful analytics tools. Above all, I have found these tools to be really useful when I have been trying to keep an eye on my mailing list emails, to make sure that all of my emails have reached their intended destinations, but also to see if or when they have been opened and what links in those emails are being clicked. As you can see, it's showing me that they have all made their way to the correct places. So if you have signed up to receive emails from me, but you haven't seen them yet, perhaps it's time to have a little check to make sure they haven't been caught up in your spam filter. To build, manage and launch your own website, go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/readingthepast to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. But now, please join me as I indulge in a suppositional exploration of William and Robert Cecil, the father and son duo who, at least so far as I'm concerned, were figuratively playing 4D chess while almost everyone else around them was playing checkers. William Cecil had first entered royal service in his early 20s, soon after his 1541 move to Gray's Inn. This is one of the 4 inns of court where lawyers were trained, lodged and were allowed to practice their craft. William, through his father's intervention, became chief clerk of the Court of Common Pleas. On the 21st of December 1545, William Cecil, who had been widowed the previous year, married Mildred Cooke. She was a daughter of Prince Edward's governor, Sir Anthony Cooke, and so William's new family connections took him to the very heart of the royal court. When little Edward succeeded his father, Henry VIII, in 1547, William Cecil joined the service of the new king's uncle, the man who had been selected to head up this king's regency government, Edward Seymour. In 1548, Seymour made Cecil his secretary. At around this time, William had also come to the attention of the king's half-sister, Elizabeth. When Seymour's regime collapsed in 1549, Cecil fell with him, at least for a time. He was, after all, confined to the Tower of London from November 1549 to January 1550. However, by September 1550, Cecil had been released and promoted, because he now sat on the Privy Council. 1550 was also the year that Elizabeth made William her surveyor. Over the coming years, this relationship between Elizabeth and William Cecil would become one of evident trust and closeness. When John Dudley, the new leader of King Edward VI's government, was elevated to the rank of the Duke of Northumberland on the 11th of October 1551, William Cecil was knighted alongside him. In 1553, as King Edward's health weakened, William Cecil was eventually prevailed upon to add his support to the plan for the succession to pass to Jane Grey. However, it would also be William that the council sent to Mary, once they had turned away from Jane and removed their support from her. During this mission, William Cecil managed to smooth his way into the good graces of this new queen. Considerations of faith would prevent William from maintaining his office in Queen Mary's council, despite the fact that he was invited to do so. However, even though he had refused this post, William was seemingly not viewed with either suspicion or contempt by the new regime. Indeed, in 1554, William was selected to travel to the continent so that he might accompany Cardinal Reginald Pole on his journey to England. On one occasion, William's association with known critics of the Marian regime would result in him being summoned to stand before the council so that he might explain himself and defend his actions, a feat that he was able to achieve. In the aftermath of this challenge or threat, William would keep a lower profile. That was until the 17th of November 1558, the first day of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, because on that day, William Cecil was appointed to be her Secretary of State. William Cecil is often referred to as Elizabeth I's leading minister. He was, I believe, her truly loyal servant, ready, willing and able to spend his labours in ensuring that her reign would flourish, that she would be safe, her throne secure. However, I do also believe that there was something that William Cecil was loyal to above his queen, and that was England, or rather, the England that he wished to inhabit, the England that he wanted to leave behind him. And for the most part, it is to be expected that these two loyalties will coincide. However, on occasion, I think, these loyalties will be found to be in competition with each other. And on these occasions, William Cecil would have to make a choice. Just 2 years into the reign of Elizabeth I, with the question of her future spouse and the succession looming, I believe that it's possible that William Cecil intervened in order to see off his Queen's own preferred candidate, an individual who Cecil thought was an unsuitable match, not only for Elizabeth, but for his England. Rumours of Elizabeth's affection for Robert Dudley were doing the rounds. While it is certainly the case that there may well have been an element of personality clash between Cecil and Dudley, I also think that Cecil recognised the peril that might be generated if the Queen was to elevate one subject above all of the others by making him her husband. I mean, at worst, it might be the cause of rebellion, or even civil war. Besides the potential for this domestic turmoil, it's also worth remembering that the right foreign match for Elizabeth would be a far preferable option in terms of England's international standing and security. William Cecil likely took comfort in the fact that Robert Dudley was safely out of reach as a possible husband for his Queen, as he was already married to Amy Robsart, and he had been since the 4th of June 1550. Perhaps, though, by 1560, William had become concerned that Robert Dudley had reason to hope that his marriage would soon be concluded, whether through an annulment, Amy's own illness, or perhaps Robert's own plans to poison her. On the evening of the 8th of September 1560, Amy Dudley was found dead at the bottom of some stairs at Cumnor Place in Berkshire. Now, I do have a video on her death that I will leave linked. According to reports, Amy had, earlier that day, become flustered when insisting that the house should be cleared of those who were serving her, that they should leave her alone. Her demise was thought to be suspicious, worthy of investigation. Had she perhaps harmed herself, simply had an accident, or had someone else taken her life? And in relation to the latter suggestion, Robert Dudley was an obvious suspect, and whispers soon began. Some of those whispers even started to mention the Queen as a potentially complicit party to the offence of murder. This was undoubtedly a moment of profound risk. Elizabeth may well have loved Robert, but in the aftermath of Amy's suspicious death, it would have become clear that marrying him was an absolute impossibility. Indeed, even after the inquest cleared him and everyone else of any wrongdoing, Robert would remain irreversibly tainted by the very suspicion. If Amy did in fact meet with foul play, I happen to think that William Cecil, or rather those working for him, orchestrated it. I think that a discreet message from Cecil would have been sufficient to encourage Amy to send her servants away. It might even have inspired her to be fairly aggressive while doing so. I think that Cecil knew enough about the law and had enough connections in various positions of power that he could be fairly sure of being able to manage the fallout in a way that did not cause irreversible harm to his queen and country. A report dated to September the 11th, 1560, so just a few days after Amy's death, hints at Cecil's belief that Dudley had long planned to murder his wife. It seems to me that even at this very early stage, so soon after Amy's death, William Cecil is arguably directing the narrative around it. If he wasn't responsible for Amy's death, which of course he may not have been, it does seem that in this he is seeking to spin that tragedy to serve his own ends. Was Cecil hoping to achieve his desired outcome, namely, finding a way to block Robert Dudley from ever becoming his master? I happen to think that's pretty likely. The next moment where I think there's the potential for some Cecil interference would come just a couple of years later, although the foundations for it were being laid in the same year that Amy Dudley died. Because towards the end of 1560, Katherine Grey, sister of Jane Grey, had secretly, and according to an Act of 1536, treasonously married Edward Seymour, the son of Protector Somerset. By the following August, Katherine was pregnant and was no longer able to conceal it, and so she disclosed her state to Robert Dudley and Elizabeth St. Lo, who we know better as Bess of Hardwicke. Dudley promptly told his queen. Elizabeth was furious and fearful, because, understandably, this felt very much like a plot seeking to create a rival heir for her throne, and so Katherine and Edward were sent to the Tower of London, where they were to be imprisoned and interrogated separately. Elizabeth wanted their marriage to be rigorously examined. Had it even taken place? If it had, was it legal? And was it in fact intended to form part of a treasonous plot against her? Interestingly, it appears that William Cecil allegedly did not share his queen's terror at the prospect of this marriage. After all, it did keep Katherine out of the grasp of a Spanish Catholic match. And on top of this, with the birth of her son, who was named Edward for his father, Catherine's marriage had provided a potential heir to the English crown, and this was a valuable thing indeed, particularly at this time. After all, Elizabeth had not and would not marry herself. She would produce no heir, and on top of this, Elizabeth's eventual successor, James VI of Scots, would not be born until 1566. For a few years at least then, Edward Seymour was a very valuable little boy. The commission investigating the Grey-Seymour marriage would rule that no marriage had actually taken place. They pronounced their findings on the 12th of May, 1562, and so Katherine and Edward's son was thus illegitimate, and this arguably nullified any claim he had to the throne of England. However, as England's current monarch and her predecessor had both shown, The taint of bastardy, even when that bastardy was legally asserted, was not insurmountable when it came to sitting upon the English throne. What these assertions about his parents' marriage did offer was a degree of security for the current Queen, because little Edward Seymour's claim would likely only be pressed if, or indeed when, the throne of England was left empty, without a better placed and unquestionably legitimate heir having been born to sit upon it. At around the time that the ruling on Katherine and Edward's marriage was being made, the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Edward Warner, allegedly moved by his sympathy for these lovers, allowed them to meet in secret and in private. Unsurprisingly, this couple's second son, Thomas, was born in the February of 1563. Edward Warner and William Cecil had, on more than one occasion, sat as members of Parliament at the same time, and so, is it perhaps possible that Warner's sympathy for this couple was, in part at least, inspired by his parliamentary colleague? Might William Cecil have reminded him that until their queen married and produced an heir, Katherine was Elizabeth's heir presumptive, at least according to the will of her father, King Henry VIII? Is it possible that Cecil might, in private at least, have celebrated the news of Katherine's second pregnancy? I mean, after all, an heir is good, but an heir and a spare are even better. Did little Edward and Thomas Seymour act as a sort of succession insurance policy in Cecil's mind? Individuals who could be deployed if absolutely necessary. I do think that it's interesting and indeed worthy of note that Sir Edward Warner appears to have been wholly undamaged by this level of permissive behaviour, because instead he clearly continues to occupy various positions of trust and prestige, and so I'm led to wonder if this might, indeed should, be read as a sign that Sir Edward Warner had the protection of somebody very powerful, and at this point there are few people more powerful than William Cecil. Could Sir Edward Warner's continued favour and place be due to the fact that he had done William Cecil some favour? And if so, what might that be? A few months after the birth of little Thomas Seymour, William Cecil welcomed his second surviving son, Robert. He was born on the 1st of June 1563. Robert's father would, throughout his life, grease the wheels of advancement in his son's favour. Robert Cecil would also end up with a front row seat to the destruction of Mary Queen of Scots, or at least to the last years of it. When Mary fled into England in 1568, she represented both a conundrum and a risk. While William Cecil's queen was surely outraged that her kinswoman, a fellow anointed queen, had been so treacherously dealt with by her own subjects. As a result, Elizabeth was very keen to ensure that Mary was returned to the Scottish throne. The same could not be said for Cecil and many of his fellow councillors. Indeed, they voiced their concerns about this particular course of action. Because for William Cecil, the idea of fighting for Mary Queen of Scots' throne on her behalf was simply too risky a move. Because, on the one hand, it had the capacity to empower Mary to a dangerous degree, but on the other hand, it might dangerously enrage far too many of her subjects. And so then the question became, what was to be done with Mary? If she was not to be returned to Scotland, then what? Well, allowing Mary to return to France was also deemed to be too great a risk. After all, she might make another powerful marriage, and in so doing, be able to obtain an army that might invade both Scotland and England in her name. And so, she could not go back to Scotland, nor could she be allowed to return to France. Well, what did that leave? Well, the remaining option was to have Mary detained in England, against her will, until the threat she posed could be neutralised. William Cecil was now faced with the problem of finding a way to legitimise the effective imprisonment of an anointed queen as though she were just another subject of Elizabeth. He's going to have to do this at least until he could find a way to see that any restoration of Mary to the Scottish throne would come with the stripping away of any real royal power from her. As it would turn out, this restoration would not need to happen, because the allegations of Mary's complicity in the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley, provided the requisite ammunition to keep Mary captive. nevertheless. As Julian Goodare points out, quote, Mary's imprisonment was obviously illegal. She was accused of no crime in England, and Elizabeth's jurisdiction over her was questionable. But political reality was pressing. Mary Queen of Scots might have been removed from her royal authority, but that did not mean that her threat to Elizabeth and to England was neutralised. Because Mary remained, in the minds of a number of people, the rightful Roman Catholic heir of England. There would even be those who were willing to press her claim while Elizabeth still lived. With the rising of the Northern Earls in late 1569, Elizabeth I's excommunication by the Pope in 1570, the Rodolphi Plot of 1571, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris in 1572, and the launching of the Jesuit mission in 1580, Mary and her Roman Catholic faith were increasingly being connected with a source of threat to Elizabeth and her England. And Mary, on top of this, became a seemingly willing figurehead for a variety of plots against Elizabeth. But even without these moments of crisis, even without the series of plots, I do think that William Cecil was concerned enough about the thought of a Roman Catholic inheriting the throne of his country, even if that inheritance followed the natural death of his Queen Elizabeth, that he would have been casting around for any way to prevent Mary Queen of Scots from ever becoming his queen. And this is despite the fact that much of the available evidence points to Mary Queen of Scots being fairly flexible and indeed willing to compromise in matters of faith. William Cecil and his agreeable colleagues set about building a trap into which they thought that Mary Queen of Scots would fall. And if she had not fallen, then I am fairly sure they would have given her a push. In fact, it's possible they did. In the months following the Throckmorton Plot of 1583, Elizabeth's councillors, led by William Cecil, sponsored a bond of association which appeared on the 19th of October 1584. Through this bond, loyal Englishmen could prove themselves by vowing that they would protect Elizabeth and that they would, quote, prosecute to death any, quote, pretended successor who might seek to take her throne or in whose name the throne might be seized. Not long afterwards, through the 1585 Act for the Security of the Queen's Royal Person, it was written into law that any such pretended successor would be tried by a special commission. And so, being involved, being named in a plot to replace Elizabeth was now sufficient. An automatic trial was now the law, whatever Queen Elizabeth I might feel about it. And I don't think this was an accident. It was intended to force their queen's hand. Nevertheless, Elizabeth was still queen, and so of course she could have refused them at any point too. I think it was also deliberate that Mary Queen of Scots, by this point imprisoned for around 15 years already, that she was, in the aftermath of this particular legal change, then placed under yet more controls. Mary was, I believe, being pressed, hemmed in the hope that she might become desperate and reckless. From almost the beginning of the Babington Plot getting underway, it does seem that William Cecil's colleague, Sir Francis Walsingham, had infiltrated it at nearly every level. Beyond this, it seems clear that he allowed this plot to continue, that he and his colleagues were willing to wait the plotters out, in the hopes that evidence might be generated that would categorically incriminate Mary Queen of Scots. Coded letters were moved back and forth in beer barrels. Walsingham and his code breakers read and decoded every one of these letters. In at least one case, they added bits of text to the letters, in the hope that any response would further incriminate those involved. Once sufficient evidence had been discovered, arrests were made, confessions were obtained, and Mary Queen of Scots was shown to be complicit. On the 9th of September 1586, Elizabeth, having been reminded of that 1585 Act, appointed a commission to try Mary. In due course, her guilt was determined. Mary Queen of Scots was a traitor. It took Elizabeth until the 1st of February 1587 to sign her kinswoman's death warrant, She then handed that signed warrant to a fairly recent addition to her council, one William Davidson. When she did so, she also gave him spoken instructions that complicated matters for Davidson. Should the warrant be obeyed or not? Should it be delivered? What did Elizabeth want, really? For Mary to be left alone, assassinated, or executed? And so Davidson took the warrant, sealed it, and then presented it to his fellow councillors, asking them to weigh in on the next steps. William Cecil is named as the individual who led the rest of the council to agree that this warrant should be sent to Fotheringay Castle without delay and enacted. This group also at this time agreed that there was no need for any further conference with Queen Elizabeth I on the matter, and so Mary Queen of Scots was executed on the 8th of February 1587. Upon hearing the news, Elizabeth was bereft and apparently furious. William Cecil was banished from his queen's sight for 4 months, which is not really a massive length of time, all things considered. And this has led some to suggest that Cecil's actions were taken based upon his knowledge of his queen, of her absolute need to have plausible deniability for the sake of her own conscience. Certainly, William Cecil soon returned, seemingly unscathed, to the power and prominence that he had so long enjoyed. As for Davidson, his rehabilitation would not be similarly forthcoming. At around this time, and in the years afterwards, William Cecil also concerned himself with pushing his son Robert into the very heart of court affairs, as effectively presenting him as his chosen successor in his place in the government of England. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, died on the 4th of August, 1598. His son Robert had big shoes to fill. He would find himself trying to hold on to and broker power in the twilight years of Elizabeth I's life. He had to wonder how the next succession would play out. Who would come next, and how would that transition go? Because all of these questions could prove to be a matter of life and death, not only for Robert, but for all of his countrymen. At the very least, Robert's position at court and in power would either be solidified, possibly improved, or he could find himself being relegated to abject obscurity. And I think Robert was very aware of this fact, and so he spent his time looking to stack the deck in his favour. Just as William Cecil had experienced competition when looking for the attention and favour of his queen, his son Robert would experience a similar challenge, coming in the form of Dudley's stepson, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Robert Devereux was, in his youth, made a ward of the crown, and William Cecil took a great deal of interest in his person and upbringing. Essex would spend time at Cecil's estate. He lived with the family, and for quite some time there were good and cordial relations with them. However, William and Robert Cecil would know that from 1589, Essex had, on his own behalf and without permission, attempted to open a line of communication with James VI in Scotland, who was at this time considered by many to be Elizabeth's most likely successor, albeit not one that she was herself prepared to acknowledge as such. Paul E.J. Hammer states that, quote, in 1590-91, relations between Essex and his former guardian, William Cecil, remained strong. However, Essex was aggrieved by the elevation of Robert Cecil to the Privy Council in August 1591. As far as he was concerned, Cecil was undeserving of such a high reward. His own labours in service of the Crown as a soldier had involved much personal risk, but so far had returned little reward. Instead, all he had to show for it were increasing debts for him to manage. And so, the relationship between Essex and both of the Cecils was beginning to be placed under increasing strain. Compounding this was the fact that as time went on, it looked like Essex was well on his way to becoming the leading man in the next regime, that Robert Cecil would simply be eclipsed. And now, Robert Cecil's position was unenviable in this regard, because James VI, who most people expected would be the next King of England, believed that William Cecil was the person most responsible for the execution of his mother. I mean, we might want to consider just how likely it would have been that James would favour the son of the man that he thought was the reason that he was an orphan, especially when Essex and his faction were a readily available option for political and courtly supremacy. Essex, already enjoying royal favour, could hope for even greater position and place in the next reign. All he had to do was be patient and obedient while Elizabeth still lived. However, Essex was in the habit of defying his queen. He went on military expeditions without her consent, he returned from them against her express orders, he married without her knowledge and permission, he continued to communicate with James in Scotland, he attempted to thwart her peace negotiations, he tried to broker peace when she did not want it, he insulted her to her face and in public, and he burst into her private rooms without invitation or welcome. And then, on the 7th of February 1601, certain members of the Essex faction attended a performance at the Globe Theatre. They had paid the company to stage Richard II with the banned deposition scene put back in. The audience at the theatre on this day would see a weak King Richard II being deposed in favour of the warlike Bolingbroke, later King Henry IV. It is said, perhaps apocryphally, that when Elizabeth heard about this particular performance, she stated, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" The Essex faction marched on London the next day. Ostensibly, their aims were to see Elizabeth removed, or rather rescued, from her evil counsellors, at least as they saw them. This group had hoped there would be a swell of public support that would attach to them and their cause, that as they moved through the streets, people would join up with them. In this, they were to be sorely disappointed. The rebellion collapsed, and those involved were soon arrested. Essex was tried, convicted of treason, and executed in the Tower on the 25th of February 1601. It has long been a mystery to me quite how Shakespeare's company not only went seemingly completely unpunished for their part in this uprising, but also just how quickly they were elevated to become the king's men in the beginning of James's reign. And I have pondered on this, and now I begin to wonder if they were put forward to the new king as a reward for services rendered during the previous regime, and if indeed they were also protected during that regime because of those services. I've come to wonder if some, maybe all of this company, chose to turn informant when they were approached to stage Richard II with that illegal deposition scene back in, or even if they had been informants from before this point. Is it possible that Robert Cecil allowed, even encouraged, events to play out in the way they did in order to leave his political enemy, namely Essex, with no means of escape? I mean, after all, that is what his father and his colleagues appear to have done when it came to dealing with Mary Queen of Scots. And certainly, Pauline Croft points out, quote, "The execution of Essex brought Cecil a vital opportunity. James VI was by far the strongest claimant to the English throne. He realised that after Essex's death, there was no English Privy Councillor who could rival Cecil, who was king there in effect. English public opinion shared the king's estimate in a libel alleging that little Cecil rules both court and crown. Cecil, for his part, recognised that reassuring James that his future accession was already accepted in England would be the safest way forward. I also believe that Robert Cecil steered matters in the last moments of Elizabeth's reign too. It was reported that on her deathbed in 1603, Elizabeth I, by word or by sign, accounts do vary, indicated that James VI of Scots was her chosen successor, that he should become now James I of England too. As I recounted in a video from a few months ago, which I will leave linked, a recent analysis of the way this event is detailed in the manuscript of William Camden's Annals, quote, shows that the deathbed scene was a fabricated addition that Camden did not intend originally to put into his story. The decision about the succession had in fact been made for her before this likely fabricated moment. At the start of March 1603, Robert Cecil both created the proclamation to announce James as King of England and then sent that proclamation to James and his advisers for their approval. Robert Cecil then read that proclamation out. Following the death of Elizabeth I on the 24th of March 1603, Robert Cecil would find that his place and influence had been secured in this new regime, and evidence of this can be seen fairly early on. James would make him Earl of Salisbury on the 4th of May 1605. This was a rank commensurate with the most highborn nobles on the Privy Council. Robert Cecil was also made Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire, and then, in the next year, 1606, he was made a Knight of the Garter. So what do you think of my suggestions about the strings pulled by the Cecils? Do you think that father and son had an overarching game plan, so to speak? Or do you think they simply responded as events emerged, or maybe something in between? Have you enjoyed this particular dive into conspiracy speculation? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. I would also love it if you could pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments too, because that will help to boost the engagement, and the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube shares it out, and that will help us to grow our community. As we have been talking about Cecil and politics and some spying, and of course queens, there are, I think, a whole host of emojis that might be suitable. I am looking forward to seeing what you pick, and I wonder why you will do so. You can also find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all of the places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please do share it with your friends. In fact, if you like the channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me that you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the time to check to make sure that you haven't been unsubscribed against your will. I do see in the comments that is still happening to people. And while you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear, and that way YouTube claims they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I'm next going live, which I do to talk about the history news updates and other new news, and I know you are not going to want to miss that. We do, of course, now have our failsafe. Please head over to my website, www.katrinamarchant.com. I will link it, and as you can see on screen, where you need to go is to the contact page, and then on the contact page you will see a little box. Pop your email in there and that will add you to my mailing list, and once a week I will send you out an email which will tell you what I'm up to and also give you any links that you're going to need for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye for now.